Bem-vindos. Bom dia. Então, agora vamos ver o professor David Horst, da Federal do Rio Grande do Sul, que vai falar sobre In Defense of Constitutivism about Epistemic Normativity.
Thanks. So I will talk in English. I'm sorry, and there's no aprendendo. But you guys can, if you have questions afterwards, you're very welcome to ask them in Portuguese if you want. My talk will be on epistemic constitutivism, which is roughly the attempt to ground all of epistemic normativity in the nature of belief. More precisely, it's a view that can be characterized by two claims. The first one is that it is part of the nature of belief that beliefs are subject to a standard of correctness, which is usually taken to be truth. Some people say it's knowledge, not truth, but the majority of the literature goes with truth, and for present purposes, I will just accept it. The second claim, the second defining claim of epistemic constitutivism, is that the correctness standard of belief is fundamental to epistemic normativity, which means that other epistemic normative notions, such as, for example, the notion of a reason for belief, can be explained in terms of the correctness standard, right? And it's the second claim that will be the focus of my talk today. More specifically, if we apply the second claim to the idea of reasons for belief, we get something like correctness first, what I've labeled correctness first, which says roughly that for some consideration to be a reason for believing that P just is for that consideration to indicate believing that P to be correct in light of belief's constitutive correctness standard, that is truth, right? And it will be this claim, more specifically, that I will be considering today. And just to give you two examples of people who endorse something like correctness first, there's a quote from Nishi Shah and there's a quote from David Wellman. So Nishi Shah says, reasons for fine are considerations which indicate whether fine would be correct according to the norms for fine. Right? And he holds that for reasons in general and also for reasons for believing in particular. David Wellman says a reason is a consideration that justifies, and to justify is to show that it is just in the old-fashioned sense, meaning correct. Reasons for belief are considerations that show the belief to be correct by this standard, by the standard of truth, insofar as they show it to be true. So, as a rough sketch of epistemic constitutivism that should suffice for present purposes, it's a view that's endorsed by many and it has many attractive features. One among them is that it promises to give a unifying account of epistemic normativity, right? We can explain all of epistemic normativity in terms of the notion of correctness, right? And correctness, or being subject to the standard of correctness, is just part of what it is to be a belief. So, but there's a challenge, there's a problem for proponents of epistemic normativity, epistemic constitutivism, which is that it is generally held that constitutive correctness just by itself is not sufficient for generating reasons. So that's a problem specifically for the correctness first claim. So there are many examples in the literature that illustrate that. One of my favorite ones is one by Gideon Rosen, which I've put on the handout, which I will just read to you guys. Rosen imagines the following situation. Your daughter is practicing the piano, but she's getting frustrated, so you decide to cheer her up with a laughable performance of her piece. You start in on Mozart's C major sonata, but you play a C sharp where B should be as the first note of the second measure. Now, you knew all along that to play the C sharp would be to play the piece incorrectly. Did this judgment provide you with a reason not to play the note? To the contrary, it seems plausible that your judgment of correctness was practically neutral in itself. In the normal case, when you aim to play the piece correctly, the thought that C sharp would be the wrong note provides you with a reason not to play it. But when you have every reason, as in this case, to play the piece incorrectly, the same thought has the opposite valence. So I take the upshot of this and many similar examples in the literature to be the following. Namely that there are many activities, mostly from the domain of games or crafts or skills, which are constitutively subject to some correctness standard, right? But where correctness indicating considerations just by themselves do not amount to reasons. Whether or not they do amount to reasons depends entirely on whether or not there is a prior reason to comply with the relevant correctness standard. So for example, in the Rosen example, whether or not he has a reason to play C sharp depends entirely, and thereby comply with the relevant correctness standard, depends entirely on whether or not he has a prior reason to play the piece correctly. And in that case, he does not. And I should also note that the relevant notion of a reason is the notion of a normative reasoning here. So in short, the challenge for proponents of epistemic constitutivism is to explain why, unlike other correctness standards, beliefs correctness standard is indeed capable of generating reasons. And to explain that without giving up on their correctness first approach. That is, without explaining why beliefs correctness standard is capable of generating reasons without appeal to other normative notions, right? Because that would imply giving up on their correctness first approach. So, and the question is whether or not proponents of epistemic constitutivism can meet this challenge. And according to many people in the literature, proponents of epistemic constitutivism are incapable of meeting this challenge on their own terms. And my aim today is to defend epistemic constitutivism against this criticism. I will show that the criticism on which the claim is based, that proponents of epistemic constitutivism cannot meet the challenge on their own terms, is essentially flawed. So why do people think that epistemic constitutivism cannot meet the challenge on its own terms? That's because they hold that what is true of correctness standards, of the correctness standards of games, or crafts, or skills, actually holds for correctness standards in general. Namely that such standards have a reason-giving force, or reason-generating force, only if and because there is a prior reason to comply with these standards. Right? So, what's true in the Rosen example, right? That he has reason to do what's correct in light of the relevant correctness standard constitutive of playing the relevant piece of music only if he has a prior reason to comply with this correctness standard is, according to these people, a general truth about all correctness standards, right? So we can put this in a claim which I've labeled reasons first, which is also on your handout, and which reads as follows. For any kind of act phi that is constitutively subject to some correctness standard, a consideration indicating some particular phi to be correct in light of phi's correctness standard is a reason for you to phi only if and because there's a prior reason for you to comply with the relevant correctness standard. Right? And that's a principle which I think is perhaps not explicitly, but implicitly endorsed by many people in the current literature on this stuff. And again, I've only put two examples on the handout. The first one is a passage from a famous paper by David Enoch, which is a criticism, which is an attack on the idea of constitutivism more generally, not just on constitutivism in epistemology, but his primary target is a constitutivist idea in the realm of moral philosophy, of ethics. But he says that the same lessons apply to epistemic constitutivism as well. So, I quote Enoch, if you find yourself engaging in a kind of activity that is constitutively governed by some norm or by some standard, this does not suffice for you to have a reason to obey that norm, right? Rather, what is also needed is that you have a reason to engage in that activity and thereby have a reason to obey the constitutive norm of that activity, right? And as you can see, I mean, according to Enoch, that's a thought, that's an idea that holds generally for any activity that is constitutively subject to some norm or correctness standard, right? Here's another example where this idea, where reasons first, is applied more directly to belief. To posit a constitutive norm for belief is not yet to say that there is good reason to do as that norm says. As an analogy, writing the same number twice in one of the columns of a Sudoku grid is incorrect relative to the constitutive norms or rules of Sudoku. Yet, there might be no good reason for me to avoid that incorrect Sudoku move. Similarly, we can very well accept that the belief is correct if and only if it is true, but still ask whether there's any good reason to have correct beliefs in the first place, right? That's just an application of the reasons first idea to the case of belief. And we can spell this out a little more precisely in terms of a view of a claim that I've labeled reasons first applied, which reads that some consideration indicating believing P to be correct in light of belief's correctness standard, that is truth, is a reason for you to believe that P only if and because there's a prior reason for you to comply with belief's correctness standard. That is a reason to have correct or true beliefs, or correct/true beliefs. Now, if correctness first applied were correct, were true, then surely epistemic constitutivism would be wrong, right? Would be untenable, because according to reasons first applied, the ultimate source of normativity in the epistemic domain is the notion of a reason and not the notion of a correctness standard, right? So, so in order to defend epistemic constitutivism, one has to argue against or show why reasons first applied is wrong or untenable, or at least does not presupposes claims that no constitutivist would have to accept. And that's precisely what I will try to do in the remainder of this talk, namely to defend epistemic constitutivism against people who endorse reasons first applied. So, and I will try to do that by arguing for two claims, right? And the first claim I've called connection, and the second claim I've called no prior reasons. Connection is the following claim. If some consideration indicates believing P to be correct in light of belief's correctness standard, namely truth, then this consideration is a reason for you to believe P. I take this claim to be rather uncontroversial because it just says that, what are considerations indicating some belief to be correct in light of the standard of truth? This is just evidence for the truth of the relevant belief, right? And so connection is basically the claim that evidence amounts to reason for belief. And for present purposes, I take this claim to be uncontroversial. Of course, we may disagree about the details of the formulation of this claim, but something in the vicinity of connection I take to be true. The second claim is the more controversial claim, the claim that I've called no prior reasons. And it reads that for systematic reasons, there are no prior reasons to comply with belief's correctness standard. There are no prior reasons to comply with the standard of truth. And if we take, if both of these claims are true, right? If connection is true and if no prior reasons is true, then this would entail that reasons first applied is false. Because given reasons first applied, these claims cannot both be true, right? For example, if you take connection to be true and reasons first applied, then this would entail that there are prior reasons to comply with belief's correctness standard, right? If you take it to be true that consideration indicating some belief to be correct in light of the standard of truth amounts to a reason for believing, for adopting that belief, and if you think that reasons first applied is true, such that there are only reasons or considerations indicating some belief to be correct in light of the truth standard amount to reasons only if there are prior reasons to comply with that standard, then the second claim must be false, and there must be prior reasons to comply with that standard. Conversely, if you think that no prior reasons is true, if you think that there are no prior reasons to comply with the correctness standard of belief, then, of course, if you add reasons first applied, it would follow that no consideration indicating believing P to be true in light of the correctness standard for belief would amount to reason for belief. So again, if both claims are true, then reasons first applied has to go. So as I said, I take the first claim to be uncontroversial for present purposes, because it just captures the intuitive idea that evidence for P amounts, or sufficient evidence for P amounts to reason, to believe that P. So the controversial claim again is the second claim, and I will try to convince you that that it's true, that the second claim is true. So, and to start, just ask yourself what. I mean, again, according to reasons first applied, what we would need, if that were true, and if connection would be true, then we would need some prior reasons, that there would have to be some prior reasons to comply with the standard of truth. So ask yourself, what could those reasons be? Right? And I mean, clearly, those reasons cannot themselves be evidence for belief, because what we want is reason to go in for truth and thereby comply or follow the evidence in the first place. So the obvious candidate for the relevant reasons, for the relevant prior reasons to comply with the standard of truth, would be benefits, right, of having correct or true beliefs. So this claim can come into forms. The relevant benefits can come into forms. One could claim that believing the truth has instrumental benefits, in the sense that believing the truth helps us with various practical tasks. I mean, if we couldn't rely on true beliefs, we would I mean, be utterly lost navigating this world. So it seems that, I mean, there are clear instrumental benefits for having true/correct beliefs. Alternatively, you might also think that believing the truth has intrinsic benefits, in the sense that believing the truth is something we pursue for its own sake, because we are naturally curious creatures, right? Now, both claims are well familiar, but so are some of the problems or some of the difficulties of these claims. So, for example, there seem to be many propositions such that if we believe them, if they are true, this would have no practical benefit. So, for example, there's an example by Thomas Kelly, who asks what could be the practical benefits of believing the truth about whether or not Bertrand Russell was left-handed or right-handed. Right? There seem to be many propositions that are just insignificant, such that believing the truth about them has no obvious instrumental benefits, and the same seems to be true with respect to the claim that believing the truth has intrinsic benefits. But I want to grant that these claims are true, in fact, because I think there's an even more serious difficulty, such that even if we take these benefit claims to be true, right? Even if we would find ways to respond to these obvious counterexamples, there is a problem because these benefit facts seem to fail to meet a plausible condition for what it is, for some consideration, to be a reason for belief, right? So for present purposes, I'm willing to grant that both 1 and 2, both of these benefit claims are indeed true, and I will argue that there's still a problem because these claims fail to meet a plausible constraint on what it is for something to be a reason for belief. And to see that, consider first what Joseph Raz calls the no-gap principle. this principle reads as follows. It's on your handout as well. There's no gap, no extra step in reasoning between realizing that the case for the truth of a proposition is sufficient and believing the proposition. Similarly, there's no gap between realizing that the case for the truth of a proposition is inadequate and withholding belief in it. Call this the no gap principle. So that's a claim about how belief is motivated within doxastic reasoning or doxastic deliberation, right? And this principle implies that there's no room for these benefit facts to play a motivating role within your doxastic reasoning. Because first, if you consider there to be sufficient evidence for P, then according to the no gap principle, this by itself is sufficient for you to believe that P. Hence, there's never any room left for the relevant benefit facts to motivate you to form the belief that P when you realize that there is sufficient evidence for P. And conversely, if you don't think that there is sufficient evidence for P, this by itself is sufficient for withholding belief that P. Again, there seems to be no motivational role left to play for the relevant benefit facts. So the upshot here is that from the first person perspective of the reasoner, any thought as to the benefits of having true beliefs is entirely superfluous, right? Imagine that you're deliberating about whether or not P is true, and then you encounter what you yourself consider sufficient evidence for P. And if that's so, then it's not as if you wait, you hold back of endorsing or of adopting the attitude of belief towards P until you've considered whether or not it is also beneficial to have true beliefs with respect to P, right? If you have sufficient, if you deliberate about whether or not P is true and you encounter sufficient evidence for P, other things equal, you will believe P, right? That's the idea behind the no gap principle. And there are similar ideas in the literature that have different labels. We can talk about their differences in the Q&A if you like. Now, next, consider what I call the reasoning constraint. The reasoning constraint says the following: for some consideration C to be a reason for you to believe that P, it must be possible for C to play a motivating role within your doxastic reasoning towards believing that P. So the reasoning constraint is just an instance of a widespread idea in mostly in meta-ethics that for something to be a normative reason, it must be possible for that consideration to motivate, to be capable of motivating you within reasoning to form the relevant attitude for which the consideration is a reason, right? There is an essential connection between normative reasons and motivating reasons, if you like, within the context of reasoning or deliberation. And the reasoning constraint applies this general idea to the case of reasons for belief. Again, then this entails that the relevant benefit facts do not constitute or provide reasons for belief. Because the no gap principle implies that the benefit facts play no motivational role within your doxastic reasoning, right? And the reasoning constraint implies that if a consideration isn't capable of playing a motivational role within your doxastic reasoning, it doesn't constitute a reason for belief. So taken together, both claims imply that the relevant benefit facts do not constitute or amount to reasons for belief. And since I think that the relevant benefit facts are the natural candidate for reasons to comply with belief's correctness standard, this suggests that the no prior reasons claim is true, that there are no prior reasons for complying with the correctness standard for belief. And since I also think that the connection claim is true, this would entail that reasons first applied is false. Because, I mean, remember, connection, no prior reasons, and reasons first applied cannot all be true. One of them has to go. And since I take it that connection is no one would want to reject that claim, and since now I've given an argument for why no prior reasons is true, it seems that the claim that has to go is reasons first applied. So to sum up, what I've argued is first that epistemic constitutivism faces an important challenge, right? Namely to explain why belief's correctness standard, unlike other such standards, other correctness standards, is capable of generating reasons. And we've seen that that according to the reasons first view, this challenge cannot be met, right? Why? Well, because correctness standards in general are reason-giving or are reason-generating only if and because there's a prior reason to comply with the relevant correctness standard. But I have argued that the underlying assumption of this objection is flawed. In the case of belief, correctness indicating considerations do amount to reasons. That's just another way of putting the claim that I've labeled connection. Yet, there are no prior reasons to comply with belief's correctness standard. Right, so if that's true, then the objection or the criticism of epistemic constitutivism, which is based on the reasons first applied idea, is flawed. But of course, I mean, just a quick last note on the scope of this argument. I've only shown, I mean, if at all, I've only shown that well, let's put it this way. I've not shown how, in a positive way, proponents of epistemic constitutivism can meet the relevant challenge. I've only shown that a prominent argument to the effect that meeting this challenge on its own terms is impossible, right, rests on an assumption that that is flawed, right? So at this point, the next step, so to speak, in the project of defending or developing an adequate account, an adequate version of epistemic constitutivism would have to engage with the idea of, or with the question of how exactly, in a positive way, we can show that the constitutive correctness standards of belief differ from the constitutive correctness standards of other activities, such as playing musical pieces or playing chess or such things, such that in the case of belief, these standards are indeed capable of generating reasons. But yeah, that's a task for another occasion. Thank you.